He's just saying that we shouldn't have to postpone achieving the goods of the mind while we are achieving the goods of the body, right? We don't need to wait to get those met in order to get the others. They are at least equally valuable, right? That just having one is not going to be sufficient. And that goes the other way too, right? So he's not going to say that people who only value the goods of the mind are going to be the most, praiseworthy. Because if you only get value of the goods of the mind, you're not going to live very long, right? You can't, deny the needs of the body to survive. So he's saying that it needs to be in a sort of equilibrium here. But he says, it is exclusively among the goods of the mind that the value of philosophy is to be found, right? So he doesn't think that philosophy is going to have this tangible value. And that's actually something I would wager to disagree with him on. And you'll see at the end of the quarter, I provide you with some statistics about there are actually some interesting tangible benefits to studying philosophy. Now, of course, Russell wouldn't have had access to, this sort of data. But, it's I think a good comment to make that while Russell thought that philosophy is only valuable to the mind, some might suggest that engaging in this work can actually have tangible material benefits as well, right? But Russell thought it was just in the value of the mind. Okay? And finally, he says, only those who are not indifferent to these goods can be persuaded that the study of philosophy is not a waste of time. Now, that might be you, right? Maybe you chose this class just because it fit with your schedule, not that there are even any schedules anymore, but maybe you picked this class because you thought, hey, if I got to take an elective, maybe I want to take something that's actually interesting to me, right? That you saw a value in studying something for its own sake, right? I think that's sort of what he's getting at here. Okay, so this value that philosophy has, this good of the mind, right, he said is different, right, than goods of the body, which have utility, right, like in the natural sciences. And so that kind of utility, right, that good of the body, that material use, does not, he says, belong to philosophy. If the study of philosophy has any value at all for others than the students, right, for any people other than you, he says it must only be indirectly through its effects upon the lives of those who study it. So I mentioned earlier how Russell's going to start talking about the connection between our beliefs and our actions. Right? So philosophy can have a value to you, right, as a good of the mind, but he says, it can make its way into the world through your actions, right? So an indirect effect on the world. If, again, you allow those changes to occur. But even if you don't allow the changes to occur, right, if you don't assess those beliefs, there's still going to be corresponding effects in the world, right? So action or inaction, right, is going to have those effects. So the value of philosophy is, in fact, he said, to be sought largely in its very uncertainty. Okay, so it's not going to have, he says, this utility. We can't go out into the world and just say, oh, I can go get a job now I studied philosophy. I wish it were that easy. The idea, though, is that by engaging in questions of the mind, right, that the questions themselves will give us the value, right? And so he's even going to say that the answers are not the most important part. Okay, so he's going to say that the value of philosophy is to be sought in the questions, not the answers. But even more so, what he's getting at here is that it's almost going to be better to have those questions left unanswered. And I know that sounds weird, but we'll get an understanding of why that is. Okay, so he says the person who doesn't value philosophy, right, goes through life imprisoned in the prejudices derived from common sense. So again, common sense, something that is normally good, seen here as a negative. He thinks common sense is a prison, right? And the reason he thinks it's a prison is because common sense, quote unquote, is derived from what he calls the habitual beliefs of your age or your nation, right? So common sense is really just an appeal to popularity. It's an appeal to what most people believe in any given region at any given time. And what's even worse, right, than this being a prison, right? It's prison because for him it's a construction. It's not actually a bearing on the truth, and you just have to, go throughout history to find any moment in time when a large majority of people believed something that was false, right? We can think of many examples, right? But even worse than believing things just because it's what most people believe is that this next line is that these convictions, right, these beliefs have grown up in our minds without the cooperation or consent of our deliberate reason. What that means is that these beliefs that we hold, this common sense, is stuff that we were told growing up that maybe at one point we questioned, but eventually we stopped questioning, or maybe we never questioned it. And so we have maintained those beliefs into our adulthood without even recognizing that they're there, let alone agreeing to them. So here I want to share a personal example going back to biases, right? So I'll just share that I grew up in Southern California, and growing up in Los Angeles, there was definitely a pretty clear sort of racial distinction in social classes in the area that I grew up in. It was primarily upper middle class Caucasian families where I lived, and most of the people who would come in and do gardening work and other types of labor during the day would primarily be of Latinx descent. And so that was just something that, I grew up with, that I didn't even think about until I was old enough to travel and go somewhere else. I had the opportunity to go to a study abroad when I was in community college. I got to go to Australia, which I would definitely recommend you go study abroad if you can.